welcome in 365 Sports. Grayson Grundhoefer, Sic'Em365.com. And Grayson, Baylor off of two close losses, although BYU for a long time was not close. I mean, that game for a good stretch was BYU jumped out in front. I think the morale on this team is better than it was a year ago in these same situations, and that's kind of clear. But they don't have much longer to keep doing this before the lemmings kind of fall off the cliff, right? Like it just they're teetering on the brink of losing whatever handle they have on the season, and playing well and getting an upset in Ames would go a long way to turning things around.
It definitely would. I mean, this week is really, really important for Baylor. I think, this doesn't feel like the make or break game. Like if you lose this game, there still is a path, and we'll continue to talk about a path to making a bowl game. I think as the season progresses, just because of the way the schedule sets up, it gets a lot easier over the second half of the season. But, you start looking at 2-4 and then saying you need to go 4-2 the rest of the way. It's kind of tough. And then like your next game, you have a bye week, and then you're on the road in Lubbock. And if you lose that game, you're 2-5. And then you start worrying about, the snowball effect that may have. So yeah, I'm right there with you. I mean, we can talk about the morale of the team being good. We can talk about, Dave Aranda's mentioned that there's momentum in the locker room, even after the 2-3 start. He's talked about how, the players view this as a much more talented team than their record states. And I think most people who are reasonable would agree with that and say, maybe not the BYU game because they just started so bad, but they absolutely should have won the Colorado game. No question. They probably win that game 99 out of 100 times. And they didn't. They weren't able to get that last play, and that's become a reoccurring theme. I know Colt Barber wrote a great article about it on our site. Just, you got to win the plays that matter, and that requires you playing a full 4 quarters. And Baylor has not done that at all this season.
Yeah, Matt Campbell brought up they've been fantastic in the second half, but the game doesn't start then. Like that's what they have to realize, and they are. Because of that, they're wasting some good statistics and some good numbers. For example, Sawyer Robertson, since he's been the quarterback, second highest QBR in the Big 12 right now. They're wasting that stat because they can't get going early. So, and especially in Ames, you need to get going early, don't you?
You do. I heard an amazing stat actually on QBR. I think it might have been on the 10-12 podcast where they went through the top 5 guys in QBR, and it was really shocking. Obviously Sawyer is number 2, but I'm pretty sure, guys like Garrett Green and Alan Bowman and Josh Hoover were the other guys kind of on that list, which isn't, I don't think, the normal names that you would point to. Like Shedeur Sanders wasn't on that list. So yeah, just really interesting number there. But you're right. I mean, starting fast is key for Baylor. And honestly, outside of the Tarleton State game and the Colorado game, they really have not started fast on both sides of the ball. The Air Force game, they were pretty mediocre. They kept fumbling the football. So you can't really put that together as a full performance. And then, the Colorado game, you play a great 4 quarters, honestly. Like, I think you could say, wow, those 4 quarters were awesome, but it's that 1 second, that one play at the end of the game that is really all that matters. You got to be able to win games, especially at this stage in Dave Aranda's tenure. They got to win these games. They got to find a way to close out these close games. And they haven't been able to do that. In order to win in the Big 12, you have to win close games. That's what it's going to come down to. And that's honestly what this season is probably going to come down to. And I even think this game in Ames, it could be pretty close, but it's hard to have a lot of faith in Baylor actually being able to take advantage of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, they're playing a team in Iowa State that is not spectacular. They're not lighted up kind of a team, but they are the absolute picture of efficiency. That's what they are. And that's where they kind of get you, is that they don't beat themselves at all, and they just take what they're given until the breaking point. What does Baylor have to do to put Iowa State behind the 8 ball in this game?
That's the tricky part, right? Because you were talking, a little bit about Iowa State. I think the biggest thing for me when I think about Iowa State is they very much take on, the identity of their head football coach, and they have a culture. and it's been established on both sides of the ball. They have a lot of continuity in that regard, and that's what makes them so solid every year. The years that they've been really good, they've had a lot of talent with that. The years that they've just been okay, they just don't quite have the talent, but they still have the culture, and that allows you to kind of overcome some of those things and not have the bottom fall out. And so with this team, I think you look at them and they have some really good players. Abu Sama, great running back. Jaden Higgins, awesome wide receiver, probably in my eyes, one of the top 3 to 5 wide receivers in the Big 12. And then Jalen Knoll, who's a veteran, who's been there a long time, has really good numbers this year. He'll beat you deep. He'll beat you in the short game. Really tough guy to guard, and then good tight end play to go along with Rocco Becht. And so, yeah, I think when you look at them, you're not going to be like, oh, blown away by what they've done. But it's just being steady, consistent, taking the air out of the football, moving the chains, and not allowing you to score points in the red zone. That's kind of been their recipe for success. So I think for Baylor to have a chance in this game, they're going to have to hit on some explosive plays, most likely in the passing game. Even though this is an Iowa State defense that's really, really good against the pass, currently ranked the #1 pass efficiency defense in the country, but they have given up some explosive plays. So when you get opportunities like this past week, when you got Monterey Baldwin running down the field, or the Colorado game, you got Ashton Hawkins running open down the field, you have to hit those plays because you're not going to get many opportunities against this defense to capitalize on those. And then on the other end of things, to make them uncomfortable, I think it's going to come down to pretty simply a couple things: stopping the run, and then the pass rush making an impact. And getting a guy like Steve Linton back, probably getting Garmin Randolph back, I think that will go a long way to helping that. But first and foremost, you got to stop the run so that you put Rocco Becht in, more 3rd and 6 type situations where your pass rush can actually have an impact.
What do you see as the style that this game takes? With being up there in Ames, Baylor has classically not played great in Ames historically. Whether Iowa State's been good or bad, whether they've been good or bad, it's just a tough place for them historically to be, and that's true for everybody, but Baylor in particular has suffered some of the most, like the ones where, especially some of those times where it could have been a momentum game for them. They lose in Iowa State and it just doesn't get back on the track. Or, we had Ahmad Dixon on the show yesterday. They had that one game at Iowa State that we thought kind of ended that season, and then all of a sudden they come back and win the Holiday Bowl, just destroying UCLA that year, and that was the game that found them. How do you see the style of this game going?
Right. Dave Aranda's been pretty competitive when he's gone to Ames with most of his teams. They've been pretty competitive. I think that, in general, I think when I first looked at this game, I was kind of thinking that this would be a low-scoring type game, both defenses kind of dictating pace, and I still think that's where I'm at. The over-under, I think, is at 44.5. I currently have it as a 40-point total at the moment. And so I do think it's going to be under, and I think both these defenses are going to play well. But, I thought that in the BYU game as well. And then that ended up being, kind of a shootout just because of what happened in the first half. And so things could get a little funky. I could see that. Maybe Iowa State opens up their offense a little bit, takes more shots, plays a little faster than they have played so far this year, as I believe they haven't really shown everything that they probably have in store because they've really only played one competitive game against Iowa. And so I think we might see some differences there. And if that does happen, that could lead to some more points. That could lead to a higher scoring outcome. But in general, I think Baylor probably wants to play this game low scoring. And I think Iowa State does as well. I think that's where these two teams probably feel most comfortable. So we'll see. We'll see how that kind of unfolds. I'm very curious about it, though, because I think both these offenses have intriguing pieces that could lead to some points. But I also think they're both so built on the defensive side. And so far this year, both have shown, a lot of strength in that regard. Baylor a little more inconsistently against a harder schedule, whereas Iowa State has been, really solid on defense all year, like borderline elite, even though I don't think they've played a great schedule up to this point.
Obviously, there's going to be some questions around Dave Aranda right now and his job security because they're 2-4, and it hasn't gone well, and it feels at times like a repeat of things that have gone on in the past. But the recruiting has ticked up in the last year. Have you seen any of that affecting them at least right now, or do you think that things would have to get worse before that tide that they have in recruiting and NIL and all that at least slows until a decision is made on who the coach is?
So they have a really good recruiting class right now, and they have a lot of really high-end guys, 4-star type guys that are going to get recruited by other schools. So naturally, you're going to have some battles as the season progresses, which, they planned on. That's not anything new. Not really. That doesn't really have an impact on how this season has gone. It's just more so that's just natural, right? When you have highly rated guys, other schools are still going to come after them and offer them. Caleb Burns is the perfect example, as he's picked up, Oklahoma, Ole Miss, and Oregon all in the last month. Like, it's going to be a battle to keep someone like that. But I think in general, this staff has done a really good job recruiting, and they've built these really good relationships. And the thing I keep hearing from recruits, commits, pretty much anyone that has interest in Baylor, is that they can see how much they've improved this year, and that's really intriguing. And on the other side of that, the facility is the other part where, these guys are coming to visit and they're getting to see this brand new facility and envisioning themselves, being able to grow and develop there, and seeing you go to these other schools and you look at their facilities and they're like, oh, it doesn't really match up to what Baylor has now. And so that's become a real recruiting tool, especially since it's brand new, just opened. They're getting to show that off a lot. And so, yeah, I think those few things have been kind of reoccurring. And so it's unfortunate that you say, all these improvements have been made, but, the record hasn't changed, which, casts doubt into whether Dave Aranda is going to be back next year. Because if there wasn't any doubt about it, if Baylor was sitting here at, 3-2 or 4-1, I think there would be a lot less doubt about, whether he would be back at the end of the year, just because I think there's winnable games the rest of the schedule. But because of where they're at and the fact that they just haven't been able to come through in these close games, there is some doubt there. And that is definitely something that I think the staff is going to have to battle throughout this season, especially if things do go even more sideways, because, if they do lose Dave Aranda, I do believe they're going to lose a lot of this recruiting class. I think that's a pretty natural expectation.
And there's the rub right there, Grayson, for everybody who's got emotions about this. Like, it is interesting when it comes to things like this, that it is not just about right now. Right now is important, but there are mitigating factors, aren't there?
There are. And, it's one of those things, Paul. I mean, you can talk about, like, you have to move on from a head coach because you're not winning. And, in large part, I agree with that. But in today's day and age, like, the money matters, like, a lot. And so if you're, spending money, to buy out a coach instead of spending money on NIL to support your program, it's like, okay, what's the balance there between, having, maybe a different coach or having a better roster potentially? That's kind of where you're also trying to play with these things and figure it out. And the recruiting side of things, obviously you bring in a new coach. It's not only going to be hard to keep the recruiting class, but also, that coach isn't going to have a ton of time to try to put together a recruiting class, and, going to have to hit the transfer portal a lot and take a lot of risks there and take a lot of shots there to put together a competitive roster. And that's the hard part, right? I think ultimately they still have to win games. That's first and foremost. You can't make this decision just based on those factors that I mentioned. I think they're a part of it, but I do think you got to get to a certain amount of wins, or at least a certain amount of competitiveness. And so if they're playing like this all year and they lose a few more coin flip games and they win a few coin flip games, and you sit at the end of the year and they're 5-7, but they've been competitive all year and have, won some games that they need to win, like maybe they beat TCU at home or something along those lines, and you get to 5-7, I think that's where, there's probably going to be a real conversation that has to be had on what to do and what matters most and what direction this program needs to go. But I still believe if they get to 6 wins, I would find it hard to believe that you would let go of Dave Aranda with all the momentum that they put together on the recruiting trail.
Grayson Grundhoefer, Sic'Em365.com. Grayson, we'll talk to you next week.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
All right, that's Grayson Grundhoefer, Sic'Em365.com. We've got so much more coming your way, including Peyton Sawyer rankings right now. Go ahead and start dropping those picks in the chat of who you want him to look up rankings-wise. Drop them right now. We'll throw them onto Peyton, and he will run them through the machine and we'll get those. That's all coming up on 365 Sports.